It's very nice to speak here about the subject with my friend from so many tasks, and the BCI, our Institute of Competition Law Innovation in Brazil, is one of them. And presenting our work, I try to do together with Eduardo, having Laura here, who's a friend of us, and I thank you, Valeria, Cecilia, Fernandes, students that are here. I'm gonna share the presentation. And the idea here for us, and if you have any questions or any comments, you can do anytime you want. The idea here is to talk about the ethical design of algorithms as antitrust. It's like an honor and a challenge to speak about this subject here in this DL4T that has so many experts on this subject. But this subject is really an important one, and this challenge is an important challenge to face. Just for people, if you want to know me, I have a PhD in law and one in law and one in economics, both from Brazil, and I teach law and economics in Brazil. I don't know, Eduardo, do you want to present yourself or talk about the BCI maybe?
Yeah, briefly, very briefly. Well, first of all, it's a great honor to me to have this opportunity, and I would especially thanks to my friend Professor Vinicius Klein, who had this idea about including myself from the other side of the Atlantic to be here with you. Although it's morning in Brazil, early morning, I'm really glad to be here. And I would thank you. I would thank also to Professor Frederic Marti for his excitement and effort to produce these kinds of events. Professor Laura, it's always a pleasure to be with you. And I'm not sure if I call, but Professor Valeria, it's also an honor to be with you here in this online event. I would mention that the Brazilian Institute for Competition and Innovation, it's a Brazilian initiative that includes many foreigners and enthusiasts about the ideas behind competition, behind innovation, and this whole atmosphere. And I mentioned in this chat that I would add IBCI, the acronym of the institute, as one of the supporters, academic supporters of this class or this lecture, because in addition to myself and Vinicius, who shared the institute, we have two other, international directors, that Frederic Marti and Laura Zoboli. So 4 of us are here. IBCI supports the event for sure. But you have my brief resume. I have a PhD. I was thinking of it. I defended my thesis 11 years ago, but I'm still young in law and economics. And I've been studying for a while this subject matter, specifically involving antitrust. I have a couple of opportunities to live in the US to study this subject matter, and it's a kind of a passion to me and to Vinicius, Professor Vinicius, to develop this research. I think we are in the 3rd year of the research so far, right, Vinicius? And yeah. we are deep in it, meaning in an incremental manner, as it should be. And that's it. You have the web link of IBCI, and welcome to visit us and to stay with us in our events. Thank you very much. Back to Professor Vinicius.
Thanks, Eduardo. So the idea to discuss ethical design of algorithms in a compliance by design setting as an antitrust tool for digital markets. The emergence of digital markets and algorithms is very present in our daily lives, and it's producing substantial change in society. And I think the institute here, the university here, are like a very important point of study about the social acceptance of algorithms, and Professor Marina Terry, Professor Frederick having good works about that subject. But our main point of focus here is the dynamic of markets, how markets have been changing by algorithms, and especially pricing algorithms. And I think that the change is very substantial due to a factor that usually when describe markets, like we have a lot of concepts of competition and dynamic markets. You can use, and then I have to use the French, you can use like a Bauhaus conception of tautonomie, or something like that, like try and error until you find the equilibrium of the market. I have a concept that I think is more interesting for competition law, that famous by Hayek, of discovering procedure, that focus on rivalry, that focus on, I think the main idea is that the information and the knowledge are dispersed in society, and markets are the best mechanism to produce to deal with that in an efficient way and to discover the prices. But if you think about this subject, I know some works that say that the concept of discovery procedure by Hayek is still on hold. It's still good to describe how markets works, but I think there are some things that must be highlighted for us to understand some changes, like centralization, the need to have lack of coordination, or to have a spontaneous order to discover the equilibrium or the price of the market, and by that, doing that without a central authority. If you think about inside a digital ecosystem, I think the process of producing the price is very different. I don't think there is always trial and error and to find a price that goes to the equilibrium. Maybe if you are inside the digital ecosystem, there is some centralized control. And also, if you have like have different prices, and like one pricing for each consumer, I don't know if you are having this idea of Bauhaus in the beginning, the neoclassical way of thinking, that you're gonna have like someone trying to discover a price that equals offer and demand. And I really don't know if you have this problem with centralization. The algorithm could be like a way of producing different prices for everyone and no equilibrium prices. And I think that kind of substantial change in how markets work is a challenge to competition law. Because if you change the reality, of course, the regulation you do about the reality must change. It's like it's a little blindness to keep regulating the same way a different reality. So I think you need to adjust the idea of how market works in digital markets. And it's the first step to know how to regulate them by competition law or by traditional regulation. Understand the dynamics have a big change. And also, if you think about a little bit about history of economic thought, if you think about Adam Smith, for instance, and the idea that there was like some natural loss and like offer and demand that people are going to discover, here we are having a different kind of thing. I don't know if you can keep, of course there is critics since the beginning of the classical economic thought about this naturalistic way of viewing markets and markets dynamics, but I think it creates in a very intentional way the framework of the markets, and it's not natural, it's created. And you could say, of course, markets are surrounded by institutions and institutional framework. Of course, a market doesn't exist without institutions, and institutions also really influence and shape markets. But in this kind of digital markets, the influence is different, I think, because law doesn't work in the same way. This is something I'm gonna try to explore more during this presentation with Eduardo. Law doesn't work the same way in this kind of environment. Of course, people do things, try to plan things, and there are unintended consequences. But when you have like algorithms interacting with machine learning, artificial intelligence, maybe there is no such thing as this unintended consequences typical of the failure of trying to plan a market and realizing for sure that you cannot plan a whole market because there are a lot of things to plan. You don't need to plan, maybe you need to train the algorithm to react. And maybe that is easier than to plan a market. So the first thing I think is important to understand is the difference of the word. And there is like an old work from Laura Lessig, but this idea that legal norms are not the only norms that can constrain behavior are an old idea. You have social norms, but you also have architecture or code. And architecture is something that you can see in the real world also. You can see the way you have like a private enforcement, and you have ways that you don't need like the state or some external institutions to impose something. And this is like an architecture. But the idea of code is that code is a norm. And if it's a norm, it can be regulated, yes, but the thing is that it can be hard to translate like a legal norm into code. And you should try to make a pure translation of legal norms into code and to norms that work in a digital environment. It's going to be very hard, and it's going to be impossible. And you're going to have a problem that code has a different nature. It has some advantages and some problems also. Like one advantage is the capability of enforcement without the state. Maybe when you have some ways of doing that by code, you don't need the state. And of course, enforcement is very important. In any law and economics perspective about law, I think one of the key points is to highlight the importance of enforcement that's not so expensive. If a law needs someone in every corner of the street to be imposing that law, of course this law will not work because the cost of enforcement is huge, it's impossible to deal with. But the idea is that have to realize that code is a different kind of norm and can work together with legal norms. Of course, there is some kind of tension. For instance, if you think about blockchain and the beginning of communities about blockchain and about law, they are always that there were that idea of not having the state and not having the possibility of like having digital coins that don't have the state imposing them, and like a kind of perfect freedom, or at least an ideal of freedom. But these kind of things is hard to keep. And of course, the state is always supporting some kind of code. When the state intervenes and reinforces something, it has some power. And a relationship, an interaction between two persons, norms that go from outside, I think that you can pick up from contractual law, for instance. If you pick up and read something about relational contracts, you're gonna see that a norm that comes from inside the relation, for instance, if you try to impose cooperation, it's something if the state's trying to impose with his asymmetry of information from the outside. But if you allow this thing and reinforce behavior and try to enhance the development by inside the relation, it's going to be a different output. So I think that's important to realize that these two kinds of norms, and they can be tension, but the best scenario would be if you could cooperate and use the two of them, the two kinds of norms that constrain behavior. So if the language of competition is not the language that used to be, and it's not the language of human interaction by trial and error to find a solution in a decentralized way of doing things and finding on market price, maybe competition law, if you want to deal with this kind of reality, should try to use code in its favor, not go against it. But there is the problem. I'm gonna try maybe to keep doing the legal norms in the traditional way and enforcement in traditional way. Then that can be very costly. If you think about digital markets and competition law, it can be very costly to try to keep updated with codes and with the expertise of companies in designing algorithms and pricing algorithms and designing the infrastructure, the digital infrastructure of a market. And this can be very costly. And this, you can have like this scenario of under enforcement, because you have a lot of difficulties to deal with that. Or you can have this scenario of trying to impose in a very harsh way the legal norms. And in that way, you can have a harm to innovation or a harm to the way the market works. So the idea is try to coordinate them. And if you have this idea, and you can go to that division of competition law that's very traditional, like ex post enforcement and ex ante enforcement. You can go there and say, okay, the traditional way of antitrust or competition law is ex post. It's the idea that you have to prove that some firm, some company produced harm, and the net economic effects are bad, they're not so good, and they are negative. So you have to punish that behavior or do something about control of mergers and things like that. But this is problematic, so problematic that the European Union, for instance, with I think the player that has more has made the first move, and with all the advantage of that, and maybe some bad sides of it, but he's the player in the world that is trying to regulate more closely this reality. And for the gatekeepers, at least, OPEC try to go more to regulation and to ex-ante thing. So at least for the gatekeepers, the companies that would be categorized as gatekeepers, they are trying to say, okay, if you're a gatekeeper, this thing is not allowed, and you're gonna change the burden of proof. This is one way of doing it, and after we realize that exposed enforcement is not so effective. But the idea of compliance by design is an idea that we have to be more flexible, because if you think about legal norms, they are one conduct, one behavior, plus a sanction or an incentive. If you do this, you have one consequence. And the idea of compliance is to try to create standards, but to allow a company or a firm to explain in that case or in that reality that if that behavior is not was not made and why it was not made. So, for instance, if you design the algorithm in a way and you can explain why you didn't allow this or that, that can be a way of trying to be more flexible and allow some kind of internal development of the norm from people that understand the language of the code, that usually are not the people that understand the language of legal norms. So we think compliance can be a way of doing that. Now I want to pass the word to Eduardo.
Thank you, Professor Vinicius. Yes, thank you very much. Very, very clear your reasoning. Well, as Professor was saying, we started this research from the very question about is the traditional legal matrix or the law capable of handling an effect or an infringement derived from a machine operation? This is the problem we tried to tackle. When we mention the traditional legal matrix, we mean a humankind performing some kind of proactive behavior and aiming at or reaching a result, right? So if we have somebody to identify, and if we are able to scrutinize he or she intention, we will be able to apply the traditional legal matrix in every law, in every legal system we know so far from the history to date. We will be able to scrutinize whether this behavior is good, bad, and should be sanctioned or should be given a penalty, right? Well, when we think of artificial intelligence and machine learning processes, we are not always able to identify the humankind in the one hand. We are not always able to identify the intention. We are able to identify the result. We can see it very clear in pricing algorithms. We can see the result. We can see the price alignment in the end of the ether, if I may, but we cannot see. It's really hard to identify how they managed to reach this level pricing, and we're not always able to identify the authorship. So that's the problem we face when we try to apply norms or legal provisions to artificial intelligence. And it's really clear to us when we talk about antitrust in price fixing cases, right? So this is the place we started this research. How can we suggest ways to supersede this difficulty that the innovation, the technology brought in a way to us, the legal operators, right? So we could try to work on to select some tools and choose some suggestions that the academia gave us so far, and rely a little more on the machines to control the machines, right? If I'm not wrong, we have a bright professor from Israel. She's her name is Michal Gal, yes, Michal Gal. She suggests, if I'm not wrong, Vinicius, correct me. She suggests you should use machine versus machine. So we should work on building up, machine that artificial intelligence, intelligent operators. I mean, machines to control or to monitor other machines, the platforms, the algorithms inside platforms. She might be right. Otherwise, There are other suggestions like the states should invest more, should drive more money to make the agencies more robust, with more people, including IT professionals. And then the state will be able to effectively monitor and tackle these infringements inside the AI world. They might be right as well. But we see in the two suggestions from Professor Mikal and from these other lines of reasoning to make the state robust, more robust than we have nowadays, we see some obstacles in terms of having enough resources, and some obstacles to really reach this wished result. Would it be a good, would it be effective to make the agencies more robust, or to build up machines that would control machines? Or would it be better to work on the cause? I mean, look a little more on the cause of the problem. And we discussed it many hours. We've read many papers, and Professor Vinicius and I decided to go through this third possible alternative and look a little more on the cause, on the origin of this problem. Maybe, Professor, we should go a little one more slide, please. Okay, and we decided to look upon this this origin, and guess what we have found? That maybe a good solution will not be present in the law language, in the legal language, will not be present in a norm, right? And we based this reasoning, that's a lot, it's still a reason, it's not a solution. In the traditional, I have some notes here. In the traditional concept of effectiveness, and this traditional concept of effectiveness is not new, as the traditional calls. It's from the mid 20th century, and it's found in the tradition, in the criminology theory, right? And upon the criminology theory, the voluntary compliance to a command has close connection to a combination of factors, such as a culture of compliance, or being compliant to the law, because the humankind believe that being compliant to respecting the legal command will generate more positive outputs to himself or herself and to society, right? This is one factor. Other factor, so a cultural factor. Other factor, the level of detection. And the third factor, the weight of the penalties, right? The level of detection and the weight of the penalties are factors connected to the theory of deterrence. So I'm sure all of you are knowledgeable about this deterrence theory. Level of detection, weight of penalties, dissuade undesired behaviors. This is a point. But we would add the compliance theory, because I'm sure all of you are knowledgeable about it. The law is always behind the social movement. Can you hear the birds? I'm in the middle of the forest. I'm kidding. I have a lucky situation to be like close to the nature, but it's not a forest. but I'm sure you're knowledgeable about, I'm sure all of you would agree with myself and Vinicius. The law is always behind the man. The law is always behind the social movement. And we are always, as lawmakers or law enforcers or law operators, we are always trying to make the law more effective, approaching it, making it closer to the social movement, right? So what if we can try, or what if we can educate people to spontaneously behave in such a way, because this way would bring more benefits to themselves. This is the idea behind of our reasoning and behind of this ethical antitrust. The main idea would be teaching this social to behave in such a way that would bring more benefits to themselves, in opposition to the idea of let's make the law more heavier and let's raise the level of detection, because doing this we would dissuade, would mitigate in a large scale undesirable behaviors, right, Vinicius?
Right.
And but of course we are not avoiding the idea of level or raising up the penalties and making the law heavier, but we are working on a proposition to add these three pillars: making the law heavier, raising up the level of detection, but still educating people to behave in such a way spontaneously, because doing this they would bring more benefits to themselves. But how it is related to the AI, because AI means machine learning. Through machine learning processes, they reach some results, undesirable results. What is the relationship? I give back the word to Vinicius, and later I can recollect this. Thank you, Professor.
Thank you, Eduardo. So this is the idea then, like to try to see if this idea could be worth it. We try to think what could be good ethical principles for AI that you can try to see if that helps, for instance, in algorithm collusion. And then say, oh, okay, there is a good report from European Union, the ethical guidelines for trustworthy AI. Of course, European Union has more reports, that has an initiative and a politics of AI that's more broader than this report, but this is just a way to illustrate the way our reasoning. So, for instance, what can find this report? The two principles: transparency and accountability. I think this cannot be more suited to compliance, because this is present in, I think, in every compliance standard. If you think about compliance, for instance, in firms, you're going to see the idea of transparency and accountability. So, but if you think about trying to write a legal norm that imposes accountability and transparency in details, like a traditional norm for artificial intelligence and digital markets, this could be very challenging. And the possibility of people from developers of AI or for the companies or tech companies could avoid that, it's going to be very high. Or you can be very harsh and try to punish a lot, and maybe you have some false negatives. But if you see the report, like transparency is defined as encompassing traceability, explainability, and communication. For instance, and this is very important in a law reasoning, if you can trace the decisions of the algorithm, and if you can explain why he did that move, it's easier to try to see the authorship of how the authorship of the algorithm can be well accountable for some movement like a cartel. Because then you could see, like, you can trace the development of the moves of the algorithm, and explain how it happened. And communication is about not passing by humans, but for instance, for cartels, for collusion, I think traceability and explainability would be very useful. And this could be a way of using the traditional legal norms of antitrust or competition law that avoid cartels or collusions, but in a more friendly way if you have these ethical principles in the development of the algorithm. Accountability is auditability, minimization, report of negative impacts, trade-offs, and redress. Also could be very important to use that in cooperation or in coordination with traditional competition law norms. Because if you have these features of trying to know how something happened and have reports of the negative impacts, and of course, cartel or collusion must be a negative impact, and see the trade-offs, this would be very important. And this would make easy to use the traditional antitrust norms. And maybe you don't need to make the move to ex-ante regulation. If this is an ethical principle that's followed by that community of developers of AI, of machine learning. But the question is this, how to have these ethical principles. There are more principles in the report, but just to illustrate the reasoning, how you could make these things work. You are going to do like a law saying you have this, or there is a penalty. I don't know if that's going to work, because you have a problem that, or you could try to have a standard and try to influence the development of technology. This could be dangerous, or you can have a problem with the asymmetry of the regulator to know if this is happening, if these ethical principles are really working or not. Then I'm going to give back. And so this transparency and accountability to make the application of legal norms and trust legal norms easier. And of course, if they can be combined with traditional legal norms, it could be more accurate and reduce regulation asymmetry and make a better enforcement of these norms. Eduardo, now I'm going to pass the word back to you again.
Okay. I'm sorry, I just had a... Okay, well, as Professor Vinicius mentioned, a word very important to us, to what we thought and to what we are suggesting, the community, right? Because in the end of the day, we're talking about communities behaving in such a way that will bring positive outcomes to society, right? So we are a community. We are an academic community. I mean, from the legal road, discussing something to be applied in the reality and aiming at a result, right? And if we are persuaded that antitrust is good for society, right? Maybe not everybody is persuaded. Sometimes I question myself, but let's suppose we are persuaded that we should have antitrust laws. We should control these economic behaviors of powerful economic agents because it's good to society, right? And law students are persuaded that we should have criminal law, that we should have civil law, that we should have these many kinds of niches of law, period. But every time we try to regulate something, every time we try to control something, the reality, so hold on, please. Every time we try to do something about the reality, we should be knowledgeable about the reality, right? So the community that writes, the community that works building up the algorithms, they are not knowledgeable about the results the legal community wants to reach out, right? So the idea is to, when we mention change the focus, we mean that we should try to work a little more with the community that build up algorithms and that write programmation, the programmers. So if we could educate them about the results we want in the reality, looking upon the wishes of the law, we will be in a better position to reach the effectiveness level we want, right? So that's the idea about changing the focus. We've written, Vinicius and I have written a paper that we suggest where we suggest to build up a new language. So I have a problem here. I have to persuade my community. So I pass the word to Vinicius, please.
Okay. No, that's important, persuasion. And the king of language is important there to talk with the cats and all. But I think we're reaching almost the time for the presentation, and let's go to the conclusion. So the idea is that competition law, besides the enforcement, traditional enforcement, use of traditional legal competition law norms, should also try to spark or initiate and reinforce ethical principles to be embedded in that sense of the sociology of law, embeddedness. The idea that this norm is really inside the community, because then the community could write some codes that have some of these ethical principles, at least a version of these ethical principles, and you don't need to have this problem of creating a tension between legal norms and code, or trying to translate legal norms into code that are very hard. And also we think that maybe the developers of AI, they are not liable in a legal point of view for building the algorithm, because they build it and they don't make part of a cartel, for instance. But that's one advantage of trying to not use just the traditional legal norm and trying to focus in this kind of people, even if they are not liable for penalties or something like that, for sanctions at all, but trying to create mechanisms to reinforce ethical principles and make flexible to how these principles would work in practice. And the state has sometimes has some experience, for instance, in reinforcing behavior of special communities, of specific communities. This is not completely new, and this could be efficient. For instance, Elinor Ostrom won the Nobel Prize in Economics, showing that the common governance of goods could be made from that community. But if you read the papers and you see the conditions to have this kind of community governance of the asset of the resource, you're going to see that the state has to respect the governance of the community, but also to reinforce that. So if the state goes and tries to impose a different way of viewing that community, the output's not the one that you wanted in the beginning, because the relations and the social relations from that community are going to be weaker, and the state's going to have to be there every time, and then the efficient governance of common resources will not work. And maybe this is a way of thinking too, and trying to think about the developers of AI and tech firms as a community that must have boundaries and must be faced with sanctions, but also must have a space to develop a code that is compatible or it works together with competition law and with law. Of course, there is obstacles. Of course, if you do nothing and the state does do nothing, these ethical principles not emerge from competition. The reality shows that ethical principles, for instance, you have this famous case of spams or things like that didn't have like a spontaneous regulation by the community, but you have to try to calibrate the way the state intervenes, we think, to make a space for the community to develop some code language that are ethical and reinforce this when that happens. This is the idea. And if you wanna adjust the reference, I can send you. And I learned one thing about with that besides the articles that like Professor Frederick has that one of these references. He has the proposal that I think it's in the same vein as this one, that having an index of transparency for platforms and for algorithms. And I learned reading the article from Professor Marina Teller that the Niçoise School of Economic Law works a lot with economic powers, and this is a theme that's important from here. So maybe we try to work with this topic and try to control this power in this setting in a different way.